Marco worked on some of the endpoints in the RAD server that's part of this department store application. So Marco, why don't you talk about what you built and then we can take a look at it in action.
Yeah, what I've done here is just create a skeleton application that lets do a couple of different queries against the database data and convert that the information that's filtered in the query into a JSON format. In this case, it's a specific JSON format for that FireDAC uses internally. So the point would be making it very easy to return a JSON structure that later will be easy to re-import into a FireDAC mem table. And at that point, you'll be able to do local queries or processing or bind it to the user interface as needed on the client side. So the components here are just a FireDAC connection that's hooked to the Interbase database. And then there are two queries that basically are relatively simple SQL queries. We can open one of the two to see the actual code, but the code is actually fairly trivial.
And if we look at the code of the endpoints, I guess here you've got your resource is called item. Is that right?
Yes, I have two resources. One is for returning the entire data structure, a list of items, a list of elements. That's what you generally put attached to a GET endpoint. And then the second endpoint actually returns an individual item. So that endpoint has a further parameter and it's triggered when the URL is item/ and then some ID that is passed to the code, and then the code can use as to replace a parameter in the query itself. Basically, for each individual item in the database table, you are mapping to one specific URL from the client. So the client calling the URL, passing the item ID, and then gets returned. And then the code does a very simple streaming of the content of the query into JSON format and returns it.
Okay, so we'll run without debugging, and that will start up the RAD server development server. Here it is, reg resource item, right? It has two endpoints, get and get item.
Yes, and then the task that we can do from that point is to open the browser. By default, it opens version check, but using /item as URL parameter, you'll end up seeing in the browser the JSON structure that's returned by that server-side code. And that same data structure is consumed by the client application. And basically what it does is rebuilds as I was mentioning, a FireDAC mem table. Then it's ready for you to use within the client any way you like, tying to a UI, doing processing, doing local storage. Once you have the data in that format, it's very simple to process on the client side.
Okay, and then you mentioned to me that you built a little test client as well.
The client is done kind of on purpose with very, very little code, but just using all of the components tied together. And again, of course, in the real world scenarios, you might want to add extra code and extra information to customize. It's certainly very nice, the ability using RAD Server and the EMS endpoint API's capability to be able to really simplify the development of the code. We had to write like a few lines on the server. There are even ways to reduce that, and we can write a few lines on the client, but the code needed is really minimal. And there are ways on EMS client to hook directly with FireDAC data. So that makes the development of the client side also very straightforward and very simple.
So if I run this and I just say, for example, get all, there's the grid of the products, for example. And then I can just put in a SKU code in the edit box and hit get button by SKU ID, and then I get the specific product in the product list there as well. Marco, over here on the client side, it's not much special to say about this, right? You just take the edit box of the get by ID.
Yeah, you pass it as a resource suffix that basically means the following element of the URL, so item/ and that element that gets properly encoded, and then you execute the REST call. The information you get back on the client, if you look at the first button one click, that in that case I'm using a FireDAC client specific Faraday EMS client, so it's completely hooked automatically. There's no extra code. In the second case, I'm using a regular REST request and REST response. So the REST response, I need to grab the content, which is a stream, and load that stream manually, with one line, into the FDMM table. So in the first case, you can connect all of the components and have the same behavior automatic, or you can just write that single line of code, which is the reverse of what we have written on the server. The server was take this query, save it to a stream, and here is load the stream into a mem table. So it's exactly symmetric code.